Hello and welcome to another episode of Webflow and Code, where I teach you the underlying code you're writing in Webflow. Yes, I've had a haircut, and yes, I look handsome according to my dad. Today we're going to be looking at conditional fields inside forms as part of our Webflow Forms Masterclass series. In this episode you'll learn how to reveal form inputs and other elements based on selections and values from form fields. So if you take a look at here of the result of the form, you'll see that in my gender radio fields here, I can select male or female or other, but when the user selects other, I'm able to type in a value. If I select male or female, then it hides. So the important thing here is to know that when the user chooses other, they're forced to fill in that form, but if they select male or female, they're able to then submit that form with no problems. In this second example, we have a drop down here, and depending on which value the user selects in the drop down, we reveal a different element or a different input that relates to that selection. And in the third example, we take the value of an input, and depending on what the user types, we'll show another element. So let's take a look at this form. Well, you'll see that it's just a basic Webflow form that's going to submit to Webflow in the end. But you could have it so that it submits to the next page, like we took a look at in last week's episode. And if you haven't checked that episode out, then I suggest you do so. But right now, this is just going to submit to Webflow. And really, we're not taking a look at the form itself in here. But if we take a look at our inputs, then you'll see that I have three radio buttons, right? Male, female, and other. Taking a closer look at these fields, knowing that this is a radio button field, and again, if you haven't seen the first episode on basic form elements, then I suggest you do so, but you would have learned that our radio buttons, to be part of the same group of elements, so in this case it's gender, they all need to have the same name. So you'll see that they've got gender as the name. Each of these so each of these has gender as a name, and then the choice name here that's incorrect, so we can just correct that one. This one is male, female, and then the value of this other one is other. Really, that can be whatever you want, but it makes sense that it's other. If we take a look at the input itself, just a plain text field, and I've got the name as gender, and actually this should be gender type here, so that it submits under its own value on the Webflow backend. It's important to note that this is not a required field at this point, and we'll be changing it to a required field in JavaScript so that we can obtain that it's necessary for the form to be submitted. If this was required and the user did not select other, then they wouldn't be able to submit this form because it's hidden off the screen and they wouldn't really know what is causing the issue. So it's not a required field. So I guess the other thing to note here is that back to in our styles, I've got the input hide sort of base class here, which positions it absolute off the side of the screen. It puts the opacity at 0 and transitions that opacity so that when I later down the line add the class input show, you can see as my input show combo class, I set the position as static and bring the opacity up to 100%. So when we add that class, it will transition in and look sexy. So let's now take a look at the JavaScript that kind of makes all this magic work and kind of go through it line by line. So it's in the footer, it's down the bottom of the body, and you'll see the first instance here is basically an onload function for jQuery, just to make sure that I've got jQuery loaded and that I'm going to be using it inside of that function. So the first line here, line 3, I'm getting an element with an ID of gender type. And if we go back to our code here, actually we need to be removing this class. You'll see that we have the ID that was created for us. It is gender type, and it's important to note the actual capitalization of the value here because we need to match those. Slight sidetrack that if I was to create, this is a new feature that I've noticed from Webflow, if I create an ID here of gender type, Webflow will actually notify me now that there's another ID on the page of gender type, which is great, and that's actually to the HTML spec. We can still create that ID, but at least we're getting a warning from Webflow now. Anyway, I digress. our input has the ID of gender type, and looking at back into our JavaScript, we are getting that input element, that element with the ID of gender type. So that's what that first line is doing. The second line is actually getting an element or a group of elements, because that's what jQuery does for us by using this $. We're getting a group of inputs that are of type radio and with the name gender. So we're being very, very specific here on what we're actually getting from the page here, and we're storing that in a variable called radios with a $sign. This is just a convention I like to use. It's an important convention that actually lets me know that this is a jQuery object and that I can use jQuery functions on that object. So here we've got stored one or many. Well, I know this is one and I know this is many, so yeah, you know, spoiler alert there. So that's what we're getting there. So now we're getting our radio buttons, and on the change event of those radio buttons, we're going to call this function, right? And now this value could be anything that you want or what's useful to you. So it could be on blur, so that when a user exits that input field, or focus. You know, in this case, this is a radio button, so you don't get the blur and focus. But let's say, for example, this is like a text field or something like that, and you focus on that text field, then you can fire this function based on that, and it's just a case of changing that. This will make more sense in our kind of third example, but just to let you know that this you specify the function that you want to react to in this first value. The second one, like I say, is a function, and this is the function that's going to fire on each time any of these radio buttons change. So, and we'll demonstrate that just real quick. And it gives us access to the event. Now, this is important because you'll see on line 8, we're actually getting the current target value and storing that in a variable called current value. And let's just see what happens. I'm going to comment this code out just because I don't want to spoil the surprise, as it were. But let's publish that and just have a look what those values are. So when we select the first value here, we get a value of male, we get female, and we get other. Female, male, other. So we actually have access to the value of those inputs. And refresh the page, jump back to our code. So then we're storing that value in our variable called current value, right? So the next lines of code that we're going to look at. So we're getting our input, which you remember is the actual text field that we stored up in our variable here, and we're toggling the class input show. Now, if you remember, our input show class actually enabled us to see, and it transitioned the opacity for us to be able to see that input. So we're basically toggling that class if the current value equals other. So in essence, if this is true or false, if it's true, then it adds this class. If it's false, then it removes this class. This is a toggle class function that jQuery gives us, and it's just really useful because it can help you write nice clean code. Now we're returning here, so we're not closing off with a semicolon, as you see there. This looks a bit confusing, but bear with me. So they don't have a toggle attribute function, unfortunately. So we pass in the first value as required, and the second value is a function, which is what jQuery allows us to do. And we do a similar thing that what we do here. We fire this function and return if current value equals other. And depending on if it's true or false, we'll remove the attribute required. Now, this is the secret sauce for when if a user selects other and doesn't type anything into that input field, it still gives them the warning. But then when you click away from it, this function will fire again because the radio button value has changed once more. It actually then removes that required function and then removes the input show. So just saving that, publishing. So there is our gender type input here. And if we keep our eye on that, if I set male, you'll see that nothing happens here. If I select female, nothing happens here. But if I select other, you'll see that the input show class has been added, The required field has the required attribute has been added, and of course you can see that beautifully fade in there, and then the user is able to type whatever it is that they want and obviously submit that into the Webflow backend. Now let's take a look at our second example, which, as you'll remember, if we select phone, then the phone number input shows. When you select email, the email input shows, and when you select carrier pigeon, of course the carrier pigeon options show. Taking a look at the HTML of this page here, a normal form, again, we're not creating a multi-step form here. I've just got a different page showing you just for our different examples. So taking a look at in the form here, we have our select field, which gives us 4 values. Please select one being the first, which is the default, phone, email, carrier pigeon. Okay. And below that, now you'll see inside of here, we actually have a group of things. So I've grouped both the label and the checkbox inside each of these divs here. These are just divs. And the first one is a text field, and then a checkbox label. So we have the name here of phone, we have the name here of email, and we have a name here of pigeon. And again, they're not required because we'll be doing that in the JavaScript. We have this special class, which I've given it called JSSelectHide, and we'll get into that. But as you'll remember from the first step and our global class input hide, this hides these values, or these whatever it is that we've got this class on, off the side of the page. We can take a look at our JavaScript just to see what's going on, and we can go through it line by line. Again, we've got our onLoad function. Now the first thing we're doing is selecting an element with the ID of contact, which of course is the select field, ID of contact there, and we're storing that in a variable called contact. And we're listening to the on-change event of this select field. Now, as I said before, it can be any event that you want to listen for, but different elements have different inputs, and this will become clearer in our next example. But on this occasion, again, we can listen to that on-change event, and we're firing this function. Now, you can see it's a little bit more complex here, but we'll go through it line by line, and you'll understand it. Once again, we're storing the current value of our select field. So the different values you remember is phone, email, and carrier pigeon. They're the different values that we're listening out for. Let's go through this chunk of code here first, because then this is easier to explain. But first of all, we have given each of our inputs, each of our divs here, an ID of phone number, an ID of email, and an ID of pigeon, and these match up perfectly with the values here. So we've got phone hyphen number, email, and we've got pigeon. So they match up perfectly, and this enables us to write less code ultimately. So we've stored phone hyphen number in a variable here, so we're getting an element with the ID of phone hyphen number, or pigeon, or email. And then we're adding that input show class. We're not toggling it this time because, again, I'll explain this just chunk of code here. We're just simply adding the class input show. Then, because we can chain, we're finding the input element, we're finding an element with an attribute name. Now we know that each of these inputs, because they are form field elements, they will have, or they should have, the attribute name. So we can guarantee that within our element here, within our ID, let's say email, we're finding an input within that, or an element in that with the attribute name. I hope that makes sense. So we're finding an element with the attribute name, which we know will be the input field. You can of course make this whatever you want if you're more comfortable using classes or IDs to make this a bit easier, but this to me just felt a bit more streamlined and a bit more reusable. We're adding that required attribute to it to make it required. Now, the problem is that if the user selects another element, another value, then we're not then removing this from the user's. In fact, let's just show that. I'm going to cut that. We're not removing it from the user's form. So we go back here and refresh. We select phone, then we select email. You'll see it keeps adding. That's a problem, and we need to remove that. So jumping back into our JavaScript code here, paste in what I just cut. Now, you'll remember that I gave each of the divs a class of JS select hide. We could use the class input show, but I want to keep them separate. I want this to be a simple visual stylistic class, whereas you'll see I prepended this with JS select hide, so that I know later on down the line that this is actually a class that's being used by JavaScript. So I'm selecting all of the divs here. So this gets all of the divs that have a class of JS select hide. Now we're removing that class input show from all of them. We're finding the input with the attribute name, and we're removing the required attribute. So we kind of went in a reverse order, but what this is going to do, it's going to store the value. It's going to remove all of our divs and inputs from the page, and then find the single one that relates to the value of current target, and then show that one. We change the value, we remove them all, and then show just the single one that's the value of current value. So once again, if I just publish and show you the result of that, you'll see that the user can just select different ones, and then they can make their selection. So here's our third and final example that we're going to use to show you the different ways you can use form elements and respond to their values in order to change or manipulate the user experience. So we have a text field here, and I guess the important things to note is that we've given it a name of animal input, and it has got an ID of animal input. Okay, and we've just got a placeholder there. This is a required field, and that is it. There's nothing else on here. Next to that, I have a div with my image that I've shown. If you remember our demonstration of the example, it's just a div with an image in it showing a picture of a wombat. Now, the only things to note here is that we have our base wombat class, just because I wanted to restrict the width, but we also have that input hide class again to position it off the page, reduce the opacity, and transition that opacity. Now, let's take a look at the JavaScript. Once again, we're getting an element with the ID of animal input, which, if you remember, it will be the actual text input. And then we're also getting that image, the div wrapping the image, which has the class of wombat, because they're the two things that we want to affect. Now you'll see in this case on the input, we have the event input. Okay, not to be confused, they're not the same thing. This is actually responding to whenever the user types an input into this input field. So it's worth exploring what different events you can use on different types of form elements. So it's the same deal, right? We're firing this event and we're getting the current value. And then we've got a conditional variable here called isWombat. And what we're saying is that if the current value matches wombat, the word wombat, and then we're ignoring the case. This is a regular expression which the match function accepts, and we're just saying wombat. So essentially, if someone types wombat in all capitals or capital W or all lowercase, we're still going to match it because we're ignoring the case with the I operator here. So we're saying if that matches, then it's true. Otherwise, it's false. So we're just by default selecting false. The only reason why I've done this is if we just left it like this, if this didn't match at all, it returns as undefined, and it just doesn't work as nicely. It doesn't play as nice as I would like it. So it just doesn't work actually. Just to be blunt about it. So we've got to do the or false here. So that's what that line of code is doing. Quite simply, once again, on the wombat div, we're toggling that class input show, and we're saying if isWombat is true, then add the class. If isWombat is false, then remove the class. So once again, just to show the demonstration of this, type in balloon, doesn't show anything. We type in wom, B-A-T, we show it. You know, you can also type this in all capitals because the regular expression is ignoring all of those things. So this might be, you know, I'm showing you here that you're not just limited to just showing and hiding other form elements. You can of course do whatever you want. Our form is now completely reactive to different actions within that form. This could be even an app. You know, this might not even be a form. Although these inputs do need to be inside of a form, I think Webflow doesn't allow you to put input elements and form elements outside of a form, but you can create a bit of a user interface here depending on those values. So it's really up to you what you want to do with this. So I hope that was useful, and I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'd love to see what you actually do with this, what different things, what different ideas you come up with. Now you know how to look for elements, to listen to different events on those elements, to read the values of those elements, and then to manipulate and do whatever you want to the rest of the page based on that event. So once again, thank you so much for sticking around. If you want to support the channel, then head over to patreon.com/fakesamgregory. And until next time, happy no coding.